Hey everyone, in this video lecture we are going to be talking about the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is part of what we're going to be talking about when we study these different levels of ecology. If we talk about that ecosystem level, an ecosystem is where you have an interaction between living and non-living components, and one of the important non-living components would be nutrients that cycle through that ecosystem, such as carbon, as well as some other important ones. And so when we're talking about these nutrients moving through ecosystems, the terminology that we'd use is that we'd call these biogeochemical cycles. And bio would be referring to you have something moving through the living biotic parts of your ecosystem. Geo referring to the earth, the abiotic parts of the ecosystem. Chemical referring to some molecule that is cycling through both the biotic and abiotic parts of an ecosystem. So we're going to talk about the carbon cycle in this video, which is one of the major biogeochemical cycles in ecosystems. There are others, such as the nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, and one that is commonly taught in most science classes is the water cycle. But we're focusing on carbon. And so the carbon cycle, we're looking at movement of molecules that contain carbon in them. One of the primary molecules is going to be carbon dioxide. And so we're going to be using a little bit of vocabulary here. If we're talking about a source, we're talking about a process within the carbon cycle that is adding more of that molecule into the environment, whereas a reservoir or sink would be an area that is storing more of a molecule than it's releasing into the environment. And so as we go through this video, we'll be talking about both sources and sinks. So one of the first important processes in the carbon cycle is to talk about photosynthesis. So this is a process where plants are removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and they're using it and converting it into glucose, their sugar. So this would act as a carbon sink because the plant is storing more of that carbon than it's releasing. Sort of the opposite of photosynthesis is cellular respiration. Both plants and animals are doing this, where they are taking in oxygen to take the glucose that they're consuming and breaking it down to release ATP, their energy molecule. So respiration would be a carbon source because the CO2 that is the byproduct of this reaction is being released back into the atmosphere. So more carbon's being released than being stored. Then down here at the bottom of the carbon cycle, we have the processes of both decomposition and burial. We sort of put them together because they go together. So this is where you have carbon, organic carbon on the soil floor or forest floor, and decomposers, things like fungi, bacteria, are breaking down that organic matter to release carbon into the soil. And this is happening over long periods of time. So layers of carbon are building up in that soil where it's getting buried and compacted. And over long enough periods of time, due to the compaction of these different layers of carbon, you can create fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and natural gas. They're just different forms of mostly carbon. But this takes millions and millions of years to happen. Again, needs lots of pressure and heat from the earth in order to form these molecules. So this step would be referred to as a carbon sink because it is storing lots of carbon deep underground. Then the next two processes we're going to talk about together are both extraction and combustion of carbon. So extraction would be the digging up of carbon that is underground. Think of those fossil fuels. And then we are going to burn them. That's where combustion comes in. And the process of burning things that contain carbon releases carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So the step of combustion is a carbon source because more CO2 goes into the environment than is being stored. Now, the carbon cycle we've been talking about so far has been on land. We do need to address the carbon cycle that is also happening in the ocean. So there is carbon constantly moving between the air and the actual ocean water. CO2 can dissolve into the ocean from the atmosphere, and it also can dissolve out of the water back to the atmosphere. There is photosynthesis also going on in the ocean because there's lots of plants in the ocean, so phytoplankton, algae, they are taking the CO2 out of the water and using it to make their own glucose. So this acts as a carbon sink because they're storing more carbon than they are releasing. There's also going to be decomposition. So as anything dies in the ocean, falls to the bottom of the ocean floor, they will be decomposed, and that decomposed organic matter will sink to the bottom of the ocean. This would also be a carbon sink because more carbon is being stored than it's being released. And just like we saw on land, the organic material that does sink to the bottom will get buried over time. It could be compressed into sediments and eventually make sedimentary rock, which is a very long-term carbon sink because this is not something, that's constantly being dug up. It's buried there for a really long time, if forever. Now, when it comes to the carbon cycle, an important thing to talk about is how humans are impacting it. And one thing that we need to talk about is how some of these steps that we've gone through, some of these processes in the carbon cycle happen very quickly, but others happen very slowly. And when you throw humans into the mix, it can throw this carbon cycle off balance. So for example, the burial of carbon-based molecules takes a lot longer to happen than it takes for us to extract and combust carbon from underground. So as a result, because we're not sinking, thinking of that vocabulary, source and sink, because carbon's not being stored underground as fast as we can take it out, there's this net increase of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere. And the concern, which you'll see in later classes, is that more CO2 in the atmosphere acts as what we call a greenhouse gas, which traps heat close to Earth's surface, which warms up our planet, and that leads to a whole other domino effect of problems. So it's not for this video that we'll get into what those problems are, but this net increase of CO2 going into the atmosphere because of human activity, where we're digging up and burning so many of these fossil fuels that took millions and millions of years to form, we've sort of thrown this carbon cycle off balance, and it's really altered the climate on our planet.